Welcome, everyone. My name is Jill, and I'm pleased to be your host for the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance's first webinar of 2026. So Dr. Maricor Arlos with the University of Waterloo's Arlos Research Lab is joining us today to discuss micropollutants in wastewater and watersheds. So these webinars occur on the first Wednesday of the month in the fall and winter, and we've welcomed a variety of really great speakers to discuss exciting local initiatives, research, and projects happening in our watershed and beyond. They are a great opportunity for you to learn something new and ask some questions over your lunch hour. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. And moving on to our housekeeping. So as always, today's webinar will be recorded and later shared on our YouTube channel. You can also see our past Watershed Wednesday series videos there as well. If you follow the QR code on the slide, it'll have a link to register for our upcoming webinars and to find our YouTube channel. We'd also appreciate that you just keep your microphone muted during the presentations to reduce any feedback. We will have a Q&A period during the last 10 minutes of the webinar, so we ask that you use the chat feature to post your questions there as your questions arrive for Maricor. And as always, starting off the webinar in a good way, in the spirit of respect and reciprocity, NSWA acknowledges that the lands within the watershed of the North Saskatchewan River are in Treaty 6, Treaty 8, and the Métis homeland. These lands are the traditional territories, traveling routes, and gathering places of the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, Stoney, and Nakota Sioux. We recognize and thank the Indigenous peoples who have cared for this land since time immemorial and whose rich histories, cultures, language, and presence continue to enrich these sacred lands that we all steward as treaty people. We invite participants to learn about the Indigenous peoples whose lands you reside, and I welcome you to reflect on your place within the watershed. So if you'd like, you can please share in the chat where you're dialing in from today, which watershed, treaty, or just city, town, wherever. So without further ado, I will introduce our speaker today. We're joined by Dr. Maricor Arlos. Dr. Arlos' research is truly interdisciplinary. Her roots and skill sets are in environmental engineering, but she has a diversity of projects that span environmental chemistry, nanotechnology, and ecotoxicology. Dr. Arlos dedicates her entire career to water research. She particularly has a strong focus on the emerging issues associated with municipal wastewater-derived micropollutants, substances released at low concentrations into the receiving environment. Also, her work on fate, transport, and toxicokinetics modeling has benefited many aspects of ecotoxicology, and she is looking forward to contributing more to the potential remediation and regulation of trace organic contaminants in Canada. So NSWA has also previously worked with Maricor to deliver the Engineering Water School, which saw some students touring water quality infrastructure in the North Saskatchewan River watershed, including some of the Sasquatch monitoring stations. So welcome, Maricor, and thanks for joining us today. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just share my screen here. Perfect. Can everybody hear me okay? Screen looks good? Perfect.
Looks good? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation. I was very excited to present my work. It's unfortunate that I'm already at University of Waterloo when I started creating that relationship with the NSWA. Really wonderful people to work with, lots of great people that just have a deep connection to water, and it's really inspiring to a lot of our students at University of Alberta when I was doing the water school at that time. So thanks for the invitation. I am from, let's see here, the University of Waterloo is located in the Haldimand Tract, which is granted to the Six Nations of the Grand River, and that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. So I am from the Grand River watershed, learning a lot about University of Waterloo's relationship with the Indigenous communities here as well. So glad to welcome and give you brief information about our area as well. So today I planning to go through my general themes of my research areas and a few examples of the work that we have done while I was still at University of Alberta, and showcasing some of the work that my folks here at University of Waterloo are continuing on doing. And I just wanted to begin first by talking about my research focus. And Jill, thanks so much for sharing my bio there about interdisciplinarity, because I really truly believe that solutions to a lot of our water issues requires really a transdisciplinary approach, because water does transect multiple disciplines. So in my area of research, I was really trained in the water quality management piece, exposure science, environmental risk, looking at fate and transport, very focused on aquatic ecotoxicology and environmental science. But with my engineering background, I started dabbling or looking into some of the solutions associated with maybe potential water reuse, a lot of nature-based solutions as well. And something that I've started maybe in the last 2 years of my work, and I think gives me a lot of joy, is working with Indigenous communities and equity-deserving communities that will allow us to co-create research questions and develop solutions for water insecurity. So this is the area of research that I'm in, and happy to chat with people if there's any interest here moving forward with the work that you're doing as well, or if there are any synergies as well. But my training really started out as, what is the water quality management within the urban water cycle? So many of us live in an urban city, locations that are connected to a water supply somewhat. It starts out with a source water, uh, finding your source water, getting our water, treating it, distributing it, and then eventually us using that, whether industry, agriculture, or municipality, that goes into a wastewater treatment systems, and then eventually back into a source water somewhere downstream where not a lot of people are taking that source water. But we see this cycle, and in addition to that, this is a typical cycle, but in an urban environment, we would usually have stormwater impacts, industry discharges that are not necessarily encountered in this water cycle. But within that movement of the water cycle, we use different types of substances and chemicals in the environment, and that's where my research focus is on, in terms of the substances that I am interested in studying in terms of their fate and transport. And these are what we call as the micropollutants. So micropollutants is a broad term of compounds or substances that are present in the environment at low concentrations. So they're present in parts per trillion levels, so nanograms per liter. So if you think about having 1 trillion blue balls, one there is red, that's an example of 1 part per trillion. So really small concentrations, and they can be further subdivided into pharmaceuticals, personal care products, natural synthetic hormones, pesticides, industrial chemicals. So many of our trace organics that we've used for a long time, low concentrations, but potentially impactful to our aquatic ecosystems. So this is just an example of a clip and a study from University of Florida that really shows some interesting impacts of antidepressants on crayfish. So in particular, I'm just going to turn off the volume here. So crayfish, in a study, they found out that when crayfish are exposed to antidepressants, they tend to be a little bit more aggressive. So typically, which is the opposite of what we would actually expect. So the antidepressants actually, instead of them being less, when they're predators, they are not as uh, they, I guess they're not very they're not acting like themselves. It alters their behavior, where they fight their predators, where in fact they should really be hiding from the predators. So this tells us that there's some impacts, potential impacts of antidepressants in our wastewater, and eventually in our receiving aquatic environment. So again, this is not the only type of news articles that we see, medications going into our river systems, changing fish behavior. In particular, a recent study in Sweden shows that salmon fish don't have the ability to if they're exposed to antipsychotic drugs, they don't necessarily know their migration patterns. They tend to forget it. So it's a lot of those impacts that they're subtle, but we don't know what the impacts might be in the future. You see a lot of issues related to sunscreens, microplastics, fish on Prozac, and Prozac is an antidepressant, um, fentanyl in wastewater, like a lot of these things that we're not quite sure exactly what the impacts are in our aquatic ecosystem. In terms of evaluating their occurrence, so I think when we look at risk assessment of substances of emerging concern, you usually look at exposure and then effects. So the exposure side is what is the concentration XYZ, what is the concentration in water and sediment and different types of compartments that we're interested in, and you tie that with the effects. So is this concentration can potentially cause an effect. So in my lab, we look at analytical, we use three different approaches: analytical, instrumentation that measures low concentrations. So a lot of the emerging contaminants, micropollutant research is really made possible because of the analytical instrumentation, powerful instruments, quite expensive, but powerful to detect these concentrations in different types of environmental matrices. I use some bioanalytical tools too. So when we collect water sample, we just don't look at the concentration of substance in X, Y, Z substances for nanograms per liter for X concentration. We also look at the potential toxicity of that substance. So work that we're doing right now, for instance, for the city of Calgary, we look at, what is the potential toxicity of the stormwater coming into the reservoirs, for instance. So you don't necessarily know the chemical, but you know the potential. You will likely know or assess the potential toxicity based off of the conditions present. And what I do then is take this instrumentation data from the lab and bioanalytical tools and look at it from a modeling perspective, like a synthesis of information. So I know now what the conditions are in space and time. Can I then use these information to predict the concentrations in the future? So what happens if there's climate change? What happens if there's spill? What happens if we do some management decisions? What can we do to improve or lower the risk of exposure of these substances? And whenever we look at water quality management, site-specific conditions vary, and we see that, and I've seen that in many of the research projects that I've worked at. Started with the Grand River Watershed back when I was a master's PhD student. I was in Switzerland looking at Swiss urban and agricultural streams, a lot smaller streams in comparison to Canadian streams. Grand River has basically takes in inputs from 30 municipal wastewater treatment plants, so a highly impacted watershed. And then you go to Swiss streams and river systems that are necessary. A lot of mixed-use watershed. The area is much smaller, so then you get impacts from agriculture, from industry, from municipalities. Really hard to discern the impacts of different types of sources, especially if a micropollutant comes from different sources, right? From municipalities or agriculture. And then when I was at University of Alberta, looking at the Athabasca River and then also the Bow River, I was starting to get acquainted with the North Saskatchewan River towards the end of my work and hoping to do some work there. But I'm really hoping that there's still an opportunity to explore that watershed as well as interesting watershed to look at. So site-specific conditions vary. You go from the conditions up in the Bow River, for instance, and the upstream glacially fed, right? So the drivers of water quality issues are slightly different versus, you have Athabasca River, again, different types of conditions, different types of priorities from these areas. And then also had an opportunity to go to the Philippines, is a lake, the largest freshwater lake there that basically faced with algal blooms or cyanar blooms every summer, and talking to the fisher folks in terms of what's for them is important. So it's really bringing us this interesting perspectives in terms of how important certain water bodies are to different people and different stakeholders that live in it. But for me, in terms of micropollutant research, and what started it all out was when I saw this photo of a fish, and this was from my supervisor, my PhD supervisor. So this is a fish from the Grand River watershed downstream of the Kitchener wastewater treatment plant. And you see two healthy lobes of male testes, beautiful fish. It's called rainbow darter, so you can't see it. There's a lot of like rainbow colors in here. Healthy male. And then this is upstream, so a cleaner site. And then when we go downstream of a wastewater treatment plant, some of the fish there have conditions that we call as fish intersex. So the presence of eggs in male fish, and that is associated to, at that time, 10 years ago, really focused on the presence of birth control pills, active ingredients, synthetic estrogens and natural estrogens that can cause fish feminization. So then the question was at that time, and during my master's and PhD, they were undergoing a ton of upgrades, and they went from a secondary, like very um, typical wastewater treatment plant system to a little bit more advanced treatment system. And I came in and said, okay, well, let's let's look at the river, the river in general, the Grand River watershed, particularly the middle part there of the watershed, and figure out how these substances would persist downstream. So if you have a Waterloo wastewater treatment plant here and the Kitchener wastewater treatment plant, so again, like I said, this Grand River watershed receives 30 inputs from 30 municipal wastewater treatment plants, treated effluents. So if you have Waterloo, a city upstream, and then down here is Kitchener, and we can see the cumulative effects, obviously, of the impacts of these estrogens that are released in these two large treatment plants, and what happens when we do upgrade systems. And it's interesting, at that time, only Kitchener has been upgraded. So because Kitchener's the only one's been upgraded, so you reduce the impact, but it almost looks like the orange color here. It means that Waterloo is transcending its effects downstream of Kitchener. And I was very happy when I came back here, and then a few research students that are completing the work eventually followed Waterloo, where they completed their upgrades 5, 6 years later, and they found that the intersex conditions have gone down in both Waterloo and Kitchener, which is a really nice story about, well, if we can afford and deal with our improve our wastewater treatment systems, it not only removes nutrients, it not only removes phosphorus, it not only removes other types of things, but it can also remove micropollutants, which is really important for aquatic ecosystem health. And if you look at it a little bit more carefully in terms of the incidence and severity of fish intersex, so this here, they have a range of 0 to 6, 6 being a very severe intersex fish, and then 0 meaning a true male fish, right? So if you cut the testes in thin slices, you look at it under the microscope, this is how it should look like. And then for ovarian, for 50% ovarian, in other words, very intersex fish, this is how it would look like under the microscope. So I checked that data from biologists, and Dr. Megan Fuzzin was doing her PhD, finishing up her PhD at that time. I took that data and then compiled them in this type of graph called a concentration response curve, where, okay, well, if I predict these type of estrogenicity concentrations in the x-axis and the percent incidence in the y-axis, I can say that, okay, if I have total estrogenicity of about 2 or 3 nanograms per liter, again, nanograms per liter is parts per trillion, so 10 to the minus 9 grams per liter, we see intersex incidence to about 80%. So this is what we're seeing in the Grand River. So for a management perspective, which was really nice and helpful for the region of Waterloo, was, okay, what concentrations of estrogenicity. I mean, we can't completely remove them 100%, but can we start looking into, the minimum level? Let's say I want to look at 20%, which is the background. So there are background intersex conditions in the Grand River. So if they reduce the concentrations, background concentrations down to 20%, or the estrogenicity down to 20%, then perhaps we're back to what the baseline condition is. And that needs to be about 0.1 nanograms per liter E2 equivalent. So now we have some sort of a target, right? A target that is really impactful for municipal wastewater treatment plants or water utilities, that, okay, well, there is evidence that if I remove it to this concentration, I get better quality fish, or better fish that are not intersex. So that's sort of what brought me that idea of trying to link exposure and effects, and being able to help municipalities or different types of decision makers create that a science and evidence-based perspective in terms of, okay, what investment should we make in terms of improving our water quality. And that brought me to my work with the City of Calgary, primarily focused in the Bow River, and this is our case study. And Bow River, again, has a slightly different demands than the Grand River watershed that I've looked at. But the fact that it's really it's a lot bigger in terms of the population that it serves here. It's City of Calgary is over 1.4, close to 1.4 million people. And then we have different wastewater treatment plants, the Bonnybrook, Fish, and Pine Creek. So these three main wastewater treatment plants discharging into the Bow. And we have upstream conditions here where cities or towns like Canmore would also be discharging some of their wastewater treatment plant, and Calgary and Cochrane can also end up, taking some of those impacts if they're not diluted enough. And then also, different small towns that discharge into their source water. So their river is their source water, their waste, the place where they discharge their wastewater, and also they recreate in that same river. So there's a lot of importance for Calgarians. So we've looked at raw monitoring data. So the City of Calgary ended up doing a 4-year monthly monitoring, which is quite, I would say, very progressive for a water utility, looking beyond, and they have their own instrumentation in their lab. They look at 55 compounds, 23 pharmaceuticals, look at 14 sites. That includes 6 rivers, the drinking water, wastewater, and it amounted to about 21,000 data points. So a lot of data points there. And then I came and collaborated with them and look at, maybe let's categorize these and see what the conditions of micropollutants in their watershed. So this is basically end up in a paper that we published with the City of Calgary. So again, really trying to look at the patterns of pharmaceuticals in here, showing different groupings: antidepressants, anti-diabetic, and then wastewater treatment plant tracers called caffeine, and artificial sweeteners, so sucralose, so things that are in your Diet Coke, Diet Pepsi, and caffeine obviously is in your Tim Hortons cup. So these compounds are actually good tracers for wastewater. So if we see these substances in our water, it tells us that there must be some sort of an impact of a sewage in our source water. So in this case, they're really interested in finding out the impact in their upstream. Like this is BR2 is their Bear Spa, their water reservoir, and then the Elbow River 2 here is their Glenmore Reservoir. These are their source waters. So what we've seen is here, the upstream, if you look at the concentrations, low concentrations, 60 nanograms per liter, but they're still seeing that because of the impact of, again, like I said, Canmore, Banff area upstream, that eventually discharges into the Bow River and then reaches this site in Cochrane. And you see that anti-diabetic, which is metformin, the brown colored compound here, it tends to persist until present in high detectable concentrations, as well as caffeine artificial sweeteners. But overall, there's not a whole lot of change between BR1 and BR2 here. So if the patterns, if you just look at the way the bar charts are created, they're very similar. And then you hit the Nose Creek area, the BR3 area, where now you have a bunch of additional things that probably are impacted. There are no wastewater here, but the hypothesis is probably from the stormwater inputs and some other inputs from this creek right here. But again, caffeine and artificial sweeteners, they are ubiquitous. You find them everywhere. And if you go further down, so now this is the Bonnybrook, Fish Creek, and Pine Creek wastewater treatment plant. These are 100% wastewater treatment. So if you just notice the axis here, it went from 300,000 nanograms per liter, very high concentrations of these pharmaceuticals, and then I guess the best comparison would be at the BR4, where it is downstream of all of the sites, downstream of all of the wastewater treatment plants. And you notice here the concentrations are much higher. One thing that we found here, again, you have that metformin, the blue ones are anti-inflammatories, the red ones are antidepressants. But what we've noticed is the seasonal patterns, and we attributed that largely to the river flow. So if we have high river conditions, we have low concentrations of pharmaceuticals. And if we have obviously low flow conditions, we have high concentrations of the pharmaceuticals. I am not sure if you can see my pointer, but I'm assuming I've been talking here and I assume that people see where my mouse is. But anyways, so that was interesting for us. We thought initially that antidepressants are seasonal because people would probably take antidepressants in near like November, December, winter areas. But we have it's really difficult to find consumption data, but there's a lot of correlation here with the river flow data. So then our research questions ended up with, okay, well, we find them in the water. What about in other matrices? So we started talking about sediment concentrations, biofilms, because we've read a lot of studies showing that biofilms can actually trap these compounds. What about fish? And what about bugs? Bugs like amphipods. And in this case, we look at gammarids that are present in the benthic, or basically the bottom dwelling organisms. So this is when I was already at the Bow River at that time, and we end up using their artificial streams facility to test the hypothesis. So if we have them in water, how much goes into sediments, how much are being bioaccumulated by these substances? So the artificial streams facility in Calgary is located right next to the Pine Creek wastewater treatment plant. So they have 12 naturalized streams. So they actually, these streams take in wastewater from different types of technology, treatment technology, so ozonation, reverse osmosis, different types or normal wastewater treatment plant like Pine Creek. And then this is here is Pine Creek fully operational, the newest treatment plant in Calgary. And then this is where the pilot scale plant is sort of like a sandbox where any person who wants to test their technology can go use this facility and sort of a plug and play system where then they can test the impacts in these streams. And also it has the control rivers, a stream where it's just 100% Bow River. So there's really a great opportunity for us to select between or look at the impacts of different treatment systems into the receiving environment. So back in 2020, 2021, that's when COVID hit. I had an opportunity to go out there with my students to collect water samples, we collect sediments, biofilms, we deploy them and see what it looks like, if there are any micropollutants in there. And then we also looked at some of the fish and amphipods and process them in the lab and see if we can find these substances. So I'm going to share some of the exciting data sets that we have found. So this is from my master's student, Daniela. So the top two charts here are antidepressants, venlafaxine and fluoxetine. So fluoxetine is Prozac. And then these two, TCS and TCCB, are antibacterials, and carbamazepine and trimethoprim, they're both, trimethoprim is an antibiotic and carbamazepine is an antiepileptic. So if we look at this concentration, so different conditions, again, more upstream, so a lot lower concentrations in the water. Then we have the Bow River, and what happens if we increase the input in the Bow River or of the wastewater treatment plant by 5% and 15%. So if we increase The concentration, the contribution of wastewater, obviously it increases the water concentrations to the blue squares here. But we also see the increase in the sediment concentration, so the yellow bars here. And then we start to see the concentrations of these substances in the biofilms. So biofilms are those um, algae or bacterial communities that are basically attached to different rocks or any substrate that you have. So we see them, and it's interesting because now it's good to think of them as they can sequester some of these micropollutants, but can they also then is that also going to impact our own biological communities or microbial communities in that area? So this is well expected, but one thing that we were really surprised with was fluoxetine. So fluoxetine, if you look at the y-axis, which is the water concentration, it's really low in comparison to venlafaxine. So not a lot of water concentrations, but if you look at the biofilm and the sediment concentrations and even the gamma rays concentrations, the bugs concentrations, we see that at much higher than any of the substances here, even trimethoprim as well, which tells us that even though it has low concentrations, it can still partition into the sediments, into biofilms, into bugs at high concentrations. So water concentration is not necessarily just a predictor of the bioaccumulation of these substances in the environment. One thing we moved forward also and say, okay, well, it's interesting. Fluoxetine, our antidepressant, is somewhat like our compound that seemed to appear a lot more often. It also has some ecotoxicological effects. And then we did a study in the lab, and Afrida Narain was my master's student at U of A. And then we looked at the absorption of these substances onto the microplastics. So if fluoxetine, for instance, antidepressants, we know already sorb onto the sediments, what about other types of pollutants like nanoplastics or microplastics? So we found that it does sorb. So if you look at the sorption coefficient, fluoxetine antidepressant here is the highest, followed by phenanthrene, which is a typical hydrocarbon, and PFOA here, PFOA is a type of PFAS, and glyphosate is and methylparathion. These are pesticides. So again, fluoxetine, they like being, it's very sticky compound, so it sticks onto the nanoplastics. And what is interesting about this work is the collaboration with Dr. Greg Goss, actually, and Dr. Jeff Farner at that time at U of A, is that some of these substances, the pollutants, are actually vectors for contamination as well. So they can travel in long distances. So would that double up then the impact of nanoplastics, because now they have pollutants that are sorbed onto them? So which was really interesting for us in terms of, you know, the next steps and working with Dr. Jeff Farner and moving forward with this research and looking at desorption, like can they be removed from the system when they go into the aquatic organism's stomach? The acidity, the aquatic environment is different, or the environment in general is different. Are they going to desorb? Are they going to have multiple different effects or different types of effects in fish? And when it comes to the emerging regulations, European Union is a little bit more advanced than the North American regions. The reason being the density is much higher. Their river systems cross multiple countries, right? Like the Rhine River, for instance, starts out in Switzerland, it goes all the way down to the Netherlands. So they decided this is in 2025, so in January 2025, they have the Water Framework Directive, and they say, hey, folks from the European Union, if you have a plant that has 150,000 people in it, I want you to make sure that these compounds are removed by 80%. So this is a wide range of substances, from antidepressants to antipsychotic medication, hypertensive, anti-epileptic, corrosion inhibitors. These two substances, you see them in your main component of your dishwashers, for instance. So they said, I want you to remove them. So this is probably a more advanced in terms of progressive thinking that, okay, well, we really need to figure out about our water and making sure that the downstream people are have a much better water quality conditions moving forward. This is interesting because they say, I want you to do or try advanced treatment technologies such as ozonation and activated carbon. In North America and in Canada, activated carbon is usually used mostly in drinking water. So for them to use activated carbon in wastewater, it's really going to cost a lot of money. Activated carbon is the type of, if you have Brita filters at home, so that's an example of activated carbon. And ozonation, the process of ozonation, it's a hydroxyl radical. It can get rid of a lot of organic compounds, but it requires a lot of energy. So I think this idea of, okay, we are trying to reduce our water footprint by making sure that our water is much better, but then our energy footprints go up. So you go back and forth with these type of technologies where, okay, there's only so much that engineering can do. There's always going to be something uh, an impact later on, depending on the technology that we're using. So we wrote this, Kelly McKittrick and Fred Rona from University of Calgary. We wrote this open access government article hoping that it can be moved forward to a lot of decision makers in terms of, here are the emerging regulations. This is what Canada potentially can do. And I invite you, if you're interested, to go and look into that open access government. So I really think that we think that we have lots of water, but you probably have seen the impact in Calgary right now. And then our region here, the Grand River Watershed region, they've stopped the development, approvals of development right now because we don't have enough water. Our groundwater is depleting. So it's really, it's becoming a challenge in many, many municipalities, and particularly where I live right now. A new win though from Canada. There's a single-use plastics prohibitions regulations. So it was now like there's a group of I think industry appealed this one. It's interesting because the other side of the story is it's going to impact our plastics industry, but it's a win for a lot of the folks that are especially the environmental groups that really are pushing for these types of regulations. So there's many things, and when you look at water issues, there's really that question of economics, the question of engineering, the question of people's relationship to water, how important it is, and it's not just a black and white decision making. And I really wanted to leave this talk with a few things about protecting our water, and wherever you are, whichever watershed you're from, is a lot of the things that have happened is because of legacy and a very reactive part of our decision making in terms of the way our lifestyles have changed in the past. So we need to look back and address a lot of that legacy. We still are trying to address a lot of legacies from like back in the 60s, 70s impacts in our watersheds. But also we need to look at today. We just don't need to look at, oh, now we're very reactive. We're looking at the impacts from many years ago. Let's do something about it. But really think about what type of decisions that we can change today so that in the future we can manage the risk much more effectively. And I want to throw this few things out there because a lot of, and it really is close to my heart when we're looking at the impacts of water, and there's a difference between global north and global south, for instance. And this is a photo from the Philippines. And when I was there in 2022, I was really brought to tears because these folks, fisher folks, are relying on fish when it comes to their livelihood. And they can't sell fish because of algal blooms. They stink. Like it's not necessarily going to be potentially some toxins in there, but they can't make their livelihood during algal bloom season. And what studies have shown too is a lot of the impacts that we do in the global north, it really the impacts are much higher in the global south. So a lot of the things that are moved in the global south that don't necessarily have a lot of regulations, they tend to have higher impacts than what we see in the global north. And when we look at the global north, there's also this interesting thing that we need to look at is, and it still saddens me as an environmental engineer, because we still have communities that do not have access to clean water. I'm trying to work and see. It's a journey for me. I know there's a lot of it's really hard to start and do something that's different from your own research and how you were trained, but I'm really open to learning a lot, and in the process I really have learned a lot in terms of the relationship of many Indigenous communities with water, and what the political barriers are for them to actually get access to drinking, to clean and safe water. Again, this idea of a global north responsible for 92% of our excess carbon emissions. So this is because our lifestyle, it's really impacting a lot of people in the south. But I think we are really a key part of society's development. And I think we start to ask these questions. And I myself don't have these type of answers. So if we just look at pharmaceuticals, right? So is there a potential for us to develop new products that are not necessarily going to impact aquatic ecosystems, right? So I'm not a chemist, I'm not a chemical engineer, but really, can we look at green chemistry? Can we tap into that process a little bit more? Or should we design new treatment plants? So it's sort of the end of pipe solutions. So, we're engineers, we are a great society that we can always figure something out. Are we always going to look at only the end of pipe solution, not necessarily the source type? Or this question about, okay, every time we have new technology, there's always energy footprint going up. So we're sort of trapped into that push and pull of economy, environmental protection, your own relationship to water, and where you stand. So I just wanted to, think in the interest of time here, potentially stop there. But before I do that, I wanted to first thank the my lab from their hard work. I'm still a new professor. I'm still a baby prof. I'm still learning a lot. University of Alberta folks were very helpful in shaping my mind as well as a PI. And now I think starting out at University of Waterloo, and really, really happy that people are trusting me and supporting me. And yeah, I can answer any questions that you might have here. So I thought 15 minutes would be a good timing. Um,
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Very exciting presentation. So I think we'll get into questions now. So yeah, maybe if you want, you could stop sharing, or if
yeah,
someone
yeah,
wants to see that, we can also post it in the chat later. I will get right into it because we've got some in the chat.
yeah.
So
Oh,
first
I didn't
question.
realize.
No, don't worry. I'm gonna read them to you, so you don't even have to look.
Okay.
You can always look at them later, though. I'll send
Yeah.
them your
Hmm.
way if there's more. So our own Michelle is wondering about, says that your graph that overlays with streamflow really shows the impact of dilution on pollution. It's
Hmm.
very true. She's also wondering if, from your Calgary example, if the low concentrations of chemicals detected are still high enough to cause an impact on the ecosystem.
Hmm. So maybe I'll first answer a question about the dilution. So we're always trained, at least from an engineering perspective or water quality management, that solution to pollution is dilution, which I think is we should stop teaching our students that. And I'd stop, and that's what in my mind all the time. Yes, the dilution is very important, and in fact, if you look at a lot of the studies, it's a really good indicator of concentrations. So if you just like the dilution factor is will tell you how much of that concentration will be downstream based on the dilution. So it's a really good indicator of contamination. But what that tells us is in conditions where there's no dilution, so really low flows, then you have these concentrations really, really at high levels. And the high levels, again, the next question leads me to answering the next question is, do they cause any type of effects? So when we compare that to the Canadian surface water quality guidelines from a national perspective, and Alberta also has their own, when you look at all those chemicals in the city of Calgary, they're below those guidelines, which is good. But except for one compound, diclofenac, which is an anti-inflammatory, we don't have that surface water quality guideline in Canada, but in European Union they do. So again, there's this definition of risk from the different jurisdictions where European Union, for instance, thinks that this is an important chemical, you need to regulate that. And then whereas over us in Canada, we have a different perception of risk. And that's managed by many folks from Environment Canada and Health Canada as well when they're establishing that. We just have a different type of environment, I guess, and dilution really still plays a big role there. And that's probably one of the reasons why it was not even in their radar. And also the idea of that 12 indicator compounds, the micropollutants that are not present, that we don't have that. So the EU, they say, treatment plants, operation, you must do this. And we should aim to do this by 2045. We have not dealt with that at all in Canada. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
I think so. Yeah, and this can just kind of be conversational. So, yeah, no, that's great. Next question is, have there been any recent technological advancements that might make monitoring for micropollutants more cost effective and accessible?
Yeah, that is so important to mention that, because one of the problems in adapting a monitoring campaign by water utilities is the cost associated with it. It's really expensive and specialized equipment. I've seen some papers right now that are trying to look at sensors, and I think there's one professor at University of Alberta, Dr. Anastasia Elias. She's looking into getting a sensor for diclofenac, for an anti-inflammatory for some of the micropollutants. So it's still very in the early stages of I think research and development. If you think about the R&D, it usually takes 10 years, right? So from the conception all the way to being out in the market, traditionally it takes about 10 years. So hopefully that works. Switzerland has I was a postdoc there, and their Federal Aquatic Institute of Science and Technology, they actually have a mobile lab where they have a trailer, and that trailer goes to different sites and do the monitoring every 20 minutes. And that's really expensive, but I think who knows, maybe later on we're seeing a lot of these technological advances where it's going to be a lot cheaper and also easy to use rather than having very specialized equipment.
That makes sense. Yeah, I feel like this is a really emerging topic, especially in terms of, yeah, for pharmaceutical contaminants, microplastics is another one, and then you mentioned the PFAS,
Yeah.
which a lot of people are kind of raising concern about. So it's really interesting. You were mentioning that the PFAS can kind of bind to microplastics, so it's this horrible combination of the two.
Yes, yes. Dr. Greg Goss, I think that was a collaboration that we have, and I was looking into the mechanisms of binding, and he was looking into the mechanisms of fish uptake. So how that impacts, and I will not steal his thunder, but they've shown some synergistic effects. So the Trojan horse effect of pollutants, where you have something hiding behind your back, and you go and impact the change, but it's still very lab-based studies. It's really still difficult to really apply that in the field if it truly impacts fish in the wild, because that could be many things too.
I know the impacts of PFAS so far, we've kind of seen they might have effects on human health, so it's kind of scary.
Yes, it is. And we don't know if they desorb too. So once they go into our guts, do they stop binding? There's a lot of mechanisms, and I think a lot of active research associated with that as well in terms of the uptake piece.
I also saw that you mentioned Dr. Greg Goss, and then it was back in 2011. So in terms of our watershed, his research looked at fish impacts at Gold Bar, like downstream of Gold Bar wastewater treatment plant in Edmonton on the North Saskatchewan River, and that there were effects and those feminization
Mm,
effects that you've also noted. So, which makes sense that it would be happening everywhere.
yeah. Yeah, it's really it's interesting because the studies of biologists here found that intersex fish can still actually reproduce still. So even though they're intersex, they can still make babies. And so then so then for a risk assessor, you're like, oh, it might still be fine. Maybe it's okay. Can they? But to what level, right? To what level do we say that is, we need to stop here? And it's still very unclear because the goal for environmental protection is usually population, right? If you want to protect, if they're still thriving, if intersex fish can still reproduce, that means their population is not impacted. But um, yeah, but it's a really tough question to answer in that regard.
Yeah, someone also mentioned that wondering if it could be legislated that the side effects of some of these drugs could be included that are more than just on us, but on the environment. But it is kind of a tricky concept because, these are drugs people
Yeah,
need, so it's a
yeah.
difficult one.
I think yeah, I saw that question from Mary Jane. It's yeah, it's a tough take because I am pro medication. If you need to, you have to take your medication. Like I don't want to stop people from medication. In fact, when I was talking in the Edmonton Public Library, one of the folks there asked me if I'm taking birth control pills. I mean, it was too personal of a question, but I mean, it really started asking, my own decision, like the way I should make my own decisions and how it can impact. And it's really it's tough because public health is the and primary purpose of a lot of the work that we're doing, and environmental health is just sort of secondary. But it is tough. Like if you just think about anti-cancer drugs as well, all different types of drugs that we don't know yet what the impacts are. I wonder if we can just revisit the idea of green chemistry. I think that's where I'm not in that field, but really I feel like we can make a lot of advances. But if they're effective for treating, for making sure that we're healthy, it's a really tough question. We could debate for many, many hours about that, but it's a tough question for environmental protection for sure.
Hmm. Well, we did get to tour a lab in the fall. It's Dr. William Zhang's lab and saw that there's some more research on how to remove microplastics from wastewater, which is kind of exciting and kind of a nice leap forward. I'm sure the research will continue to develop. And I
Yeah,
saw there's also microplastic kind of
yeah.
research with your lab as well.
Yeah, it's you can tell that if you go to the ecotoxicology perspective, many of them would say it's not an issue. You'll be fine. But I think a lot of it now is driven by public perception, which I think is very important for a lot of ecotoxicologists and engineers also to think about um, public perception as part of decision making. So even though it comes down to, like, if your water smells weird, it doesn't mean that it's actually not healthy. It's just a taste and odor impact. But public perception is a very important piece of decision making. So yeah, so it's when I go to conferences, you see these two groups of people that are like microplastics is bad, and the other one's like, no, it's not. So
Mm,
it's really, but I'm like, well, it doesn't matter what's good or bad. You really have to factor in the way the public also sees it, but also making sure that they're informed in terms of the communication. So, for instance, a lot of people are saying, like, what if I drink my water that has this drugs? I'm like, well, you actually need to drink 2,000 liters. We calculated this 2,000 liters of
mm,
water to have the same therapeutic effect of caffeine in that same water. So it's not necessarily like, yes, they're there, but it's not really in terms of a public health risk. I would say you need to drink lots of water in order for you to have that same effect.
that makes sense. I think as well, kind of depends where you're living, but if people are turning to plastic water bottles instead of tap water out of concern for the state of tap water. I think that a lot of research has shown that those water bottles kind of carry all the same contaminants that water from the tap has.
Yeah, it is. It's also I'm a big tap water drinker,
Yeah.
and in
Same.
fact, there's some of the ions there that are naturally present that are actually good for you. And because I know that the engineers do their best to treat the water so that we can drink it safely from the tap. So it is it's really quite ironic. But when I was born and raised in the Philippines, so actually going back here or coming to Canada, my parents would buy these uh 500 ml like Nestle bottles. And then I had to tell them when I took out environmental engineering, actually, the water here is safe. We can drink the water from the tap, which is a different experience that I have when I was in the Philippines because we can't drink water from the tap. So we're very, very blessed in that regard.
I think so. Still very lucky to have the treatment systems that we have. But Michelle's wondering about in-home filtration systems for wastewater that would help reduce the amount of microplastics that go into the water treatment center. She's
Yes,
heard of
so
filters for washing machines to reduce
right.
microplastics, but
Yeah,
not for
so there,
medications.
when it comes to micropollutant type of decision making for treatment, some people look at it like let's deal with it from the source. And I've seen some studies in startup companies that actually wanted to, so they actually have some sort of a filter attached in their washing machines to filter some of those and prevent it from going. Um, yes, it comes down to how much are we willing to invest, because then is there any incentives for us to invest in these systems? So again, it goes back to a lot of water issues transects multiple disciplines, and then they like, would the government be able to give us some, it's just like using the solar panels, right? Like it comes out of my own pocket, but can I be incentivized for this? And also water reuse in the house, the gray water system. So we have the same water quality in our toilet as if it's the drinking water, right? So is there a potential way to do it differently? And it really comes down to like, oh, I need to retrofit my home. Like that's going to be a lot of money. So um I guess yes, like those small decisions really help. But I think that requires there has to be some sort of a foundational regulation or policies that would actually influence the value system of the people in our watershed. It's tough. Making decisions that are tough when it comes to like environmental decisions.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think just one last question here. First of all, Ken Crutchfield is wondering about
Oh,
if the city of Edmonton has comparable testing as the city of Calgary.
I'm not aware of. I think I know Epcor. I bet they have done that in the past, and they probably um real. I have a feeling because I talked to a few folks, and they've done it for a few chemicals, but I guess the decision, okay, well, we've done it. It's not a lot of concentrations. Maybe we can just focus on something else, but I'm not sure about long-term monitoring. So I know they've done maybe a one-off assessment, but in terms of long-term monitoring, I'm not quite sure. So the city of Calgary, from this experience that I had with them, they now narrow it down to 6 micropollutants because it gets so expensive as opposed to 55. So they regularly monitor that as part of their water treatment monitoring program. And when I talk to them, they would always say, I'd rather, because just in case it gets, it's going to get some laws and regulations going to get regulated later on, because I know that the water utilities will do their work as soon as they're regulated, but it really does require a lot of like decision making. Where are we going to get money? Decision of, I can already see a water utility or a city saying, I'd rather build hospitals than do this because I think public health is more important. So I bet they're like really having so many decisions that they have to make in terms of what's best for their community.
hmm Yeah, it's a good perspective. I think there's a ton of variables at play here. It could be difficult. And from what I've
Yeah.
seen, Epcor's done a little bit of research on
Yeah.
it, but I have to look into it more. And
Yeah.
then one last question to kind of finish things
Yeah.
off, is that someone's wondering how you kind of maintain optimism and keep up your own sense of hope in this research, which can be so disheartening.
I I want to save the world.
Mhm.
I'm just like I want to do something and I will not stop. And I think it's really and it's making me cry because like sometimes I question, you know, what I do in this world. And if I want to think about my legacy, I really want to focus on making sure that our young people have strong connection to water. And I'll do what I can in my best of my ability because I think I was just born to do this. I think and I will not go and think about anything else. And if we start that and we tell them that it's a very important resource, I feel like there's a great opportunity for us to tap into that talent that I was taught differently when I was an undergrad. I was taught climate change is not really there, right? But so now you see this generation of people that are starting to understand and appreciate the impact, the anthropogenic impact that we have. So I am hopeful in that way. There's definitely a lot of times where I just go home and I'm like, what have I done in this world? Like nothing. But it is my personal journey as well. So
Mhm. Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much for those heartfelt words. And a lot of people in the comments are saying thanks for your research. And it's great you're keeping that optimistic view and
oh,
just
thanks.
trying to keep making things better.
And and when you hang out with water people, honestly, they're the most passionate people I've seen. So the NSWA folks, just 100%. Like I think it's so infectious too. So when you hang out with like conservation authorities or groups, watershed groups, they're just so passionate, and I think it's just very infectious too, and that helps quite a bit.
Mhm. Oh, I agree. Well, thanks so much. I'm just gonna share just a couple things before we finish off. As always, the recording's on YouTube. You can follow the QR code. You can become an NSWA member and receive our newsletter each month to keep up to date on things and learn how to volunteer and things like that. You can follow us on social media. Another exciting thing to plug is if you go to our website, you'll find information about our new State of the Watershed report, which has a ton of information on 27 indicators of watershed health for the North Saskatchewan River watershed. So we'll have more information about that as the months go on. And then next time, March 4th, we have Carrie O'Shaughnessy from Cows and Fish discussing the Vermilion River, which is a tributary of the North Saskatchewan River, just all about its history and ecology. And then on April 8th, we have our own Mary Ellen Shane, who's discussing the new NSRB, so North Saskatchewan River Basin roadmap for projecting water quantity, risks assessments, and looking at the future of the basin, which is pretty exciting. So thanks everyone for joining us. And yeah, thank you so much, Maricor, as of course, for sharing your time for this lunch hour.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'll talk to you all soon. Bye
Amazing.
now.
Bye, everyone.